think we're going good.
You're doing fine as far as I'm concerned, but he's the best as the...
You know what's nice about these things, and the farther along we go, the more apparent it becomes, and we'll make it nice in the end.
At the time of Charles Ray coming to the aid of the folks up at Summit and recovering the Florio girl's body, it was I guess it was maybe a few weeks later, there was a nice item in the local paper which expressed the appreciation of the community. Charles Ray wasn't mentioned by name, but you got the point. I don't know just why, whether the minister was sensitive of mentioning a prominent black person in the community or not, I don't know. But I will add that just last night I was having a good visit on Summit Lake. Just my wife and I are in a cottage up there for the next 2 weeks, and people by the name of Warner, Harold and Elizabeth Warner, have a nice cottage up there. And as we talked about various things, this subject came up, and they pointed out to the lake and said it was about there where this tragedy happened in Summit Lake, and that brought it home, you know,
Yes.
as it did to you.
Yes. So,
I wonder if I suppose that Charles Ray, in his work on the railroad, he was probably one of several workers, wasn't he? In fact, I've heard some people refer to him as being a foreman. Maybe he was in later years. And perhaps these, you remember we hear from history that a lot of Italians were brought in
right.
to work on the railroad. And maybe Little Italy had its origin there,
That's a possibility.
you know, in connection with the railroad, and Claude was working with some Italian workers, I don't know.
Yeah, Claude worked for the railroad too, summers when he was in high school.
Oh, I
so
see.
he had a part in
Yeah,
in
had
that
a
as well.
touch of it.
Right.
Yeah. Do you have any special recollections about Claude's uncle, Robert Ray?
Not really. I just knew that he had an uncle, Robert, died quite young.
Yeah, he was just in his 30s, I think.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And he was a pressman for the, I think it was the Cobleskill Index, which was a local Cobleskill paper. But other than that, I really don't, they used to talk about Uncle Robert.
Yeah.
I don't-
There is a news item in the scrapbook about, in connection with his death.
Yes.
And, well, also there's a good little, the little booklet from the funeral. That's quite a valuable resource, because that lists all the people that attended, all the people that sent flowers and so on. And it's
yeah.
all probably in Grandma Ray's hand, I don't know. But anyway, it does mention that he was an assistant Boy Scout master, and also at the funeral, flowers were sent by the Cobleskill Index, Schoharie Republican, Edgar Ryder, Sharon Moores, these were prominent citizens at the time, and many others, but that was kind of an
Right.
interesting thing. Well, now let me see, what other things come to your mind?
As far as Robert is concerned?
Well, just generally, any things that,
Well, I know that you mentioned his need for helping the Boy Scouts, and I know that that's one thing that they talked about frequently, how much he liked children, that he had a real interest in young people and youth groups, and did a lot through the church as well, through Boy Scouts, through youth groups, through church, and so he was my understanding, he was quite a young man.
the Ray family was closely associated with the Cobleskill Methodist Church, wasn't it?
Very much so, yes.
The whole, yeah.
They as far as I know that at one time we celebrated a 50th anniversary, that Claude's parents had been members of that church for 50 years.
Oh.
And so they were, all the children went to that church and went to Sunday school there. they belonged to that church for a number of years. I often heard them talk about each minister as the years went by,
Oh.
the different names of the different ministers in the church. So that was something that they did together as a family. You know, they worshiped together, and you know they'd go to church together, and so it was pretty important in their lives back then.
One of Charles Ray's other brothers was Harold Ray. And I think it's worth noting that he was a veteran of World War I,
Yes.
and that the Fred Stilson post of the American Legion, as was the practice at that time, when at the time of his death, the American flag was lowered to half-mast, flown at half-mast for I don't know how long, for a day or a week or whatever, out of respect for him because he was a member of that post. I thought it was interesting in the scrapbook, interesting, poignant, tragic. The one page in there that she has death notices of three of this was the family grandparent Edna Ray's family, 3 children that died of consumption, TB. And of course, that's something we forget. The whole society tends to forget that tuberculosis was a pretty serious thing among whites as well as blacks. It wasn't just confined to blacks.
Right.
And then Edna's husband, at the age of 41, he died of tubercular meningitis.
Mm-hmm.
There was an item on his death naturally in there. So that was quite a devastating thing.
Right.
They did have a large family. It didn't wipe them out, but it made a big dent in the family.
Right.
And then another thing that, along the same lines, but not dealing with a certain kind of illness, is when Beatrice died. Now let me see. Was Beatrice one of Charles' sisters?
Right.
Yeah, Charles' sisters. Claude's aunt, she would be.
Right.
When she died, she must have been especially loved in the family because there were these in memoriams a year afterwards, 2 years afterwards there's one, 3 years, 4 years, 5, and then even 9 years later there was another one.
Right.
And that was kind of striking from the book.
That's it. I guess within the Ray family too, that's a date that most of us can't forget, because on the day that Beatrice Ray died, Claude's oldest sister was born on that day.
Oh.
So we always can remember the date and the time that
That was in
Beatrice Ray
1920.
died. 1920.
1920.
Now my sister-in-law will know. Everybody will know how old she is.
Uh-oh.
So
Giving
now
away
I'm in
the
trouble.
family secret.
But I think a good, maybe at this point too, is to note too that we took Claude's father, when he was a young man, lived in Lawyersville. And there was a house across from the now Van Wagenen farm. And it was Van Wagenen farm back then as well. And Claude's father, as a young boy, lived in a house there, and it burned down. And but we were, the thing that happened in my own immediate family was that quite a number of years ago, we moved from Barnerville to Lawyersville, and we moved into this house in Lawyersville, and we found out later, my father-in-law said, oh, the lot next to that house is where I used to live as a child, and that house burned down. And so it was, back then, it was very interesting that, that happened. And I heard Claude's dad talk about, how the neighbors had been, regardless to color or whatever, here was a family in trouble, here was a family who needed some things, and everybody within the neighborhood came out to help that family. And I remember her saying that that was really important.
I think two things that I remember from the clippings in there, and that one was that this was Claude's grandfather, that is father of the family. He was down here in Cobleskill, and he went rushing home because he had $35 upstairs in this dwelling, and unfortunately he arrived too late to rescue his $35, which is, was a lot of money
That's right.
in those days, and certainly to this family it was. Then the other part of it was that Beatrice, the beloved Beatrice, she was the one that came rushing into the room where her mother was braiding rugs or something, and said, "Ma, the kitchen's on fire," or whatever. And we might just, good to mention, going way back, the origin of, as far back as we know of the family. Would you like to say anything about that, about Edna's parents? Let's see, Peter Vedder, and he came up from the south.
Okay.
He fled to Canada via the Underground Railroad and so on.
Right. He like you said, he fled to Canada, and during that time, the kind of work, I wondered too. I asked my father-in-law, well, what kind of work did people do back then? And he used to cane chairs for a living.
Oh.
And so he came from the south through the Underground Railway and went to Canada and spent, I don't know how many years there, but he spent some time there. Then went back south for a while and spent some time there. And then later ended up in Schoharie, New York, and raised his family, was married and raised his family in Schoharie. So it was interesting that Claude's father was able to give us that piece of information.
Yeah, apparently.
And that's about as far back as I can remember.
Yeah, apparently he went. Of course, you had to go to Canada to be sure you got your freedom, because the agents from the south could still come up north and
right.
grab people. Sometimes they grabbed free men and women
Right.
and took them back. That was so. But I think probably he went back down south, as you said, probably in 1868 or somewhere in there, right after the Civil War. Then he could feel free to go back.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think the interesting thing for me too is Claude's dad used to like to just ride around, and one day he said, I asked him something about where he was born, and of course he was born in Lawrersville, but he lived in Schoharie for a while, and just off of, I can't remember the name of the road now, Sodom Road.
Oh yes.
Just off of Sodom Road there, he said that his parents built a log cabin, and that's where he remembered living as a child, and that they had property there. And just 10 or 15 years ago, when we were out riding one day, little did I know, I had been in that house when I worked for one of the local programs. I had occasion to go all over the county to work in different places, and I was able to get into that house. And it was the house that his parents had built, his grandfather had built. So that was interesting.
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't hurt, because this is all part of the history, to mention anything about Claude's life, and when you got married, and anything important, or memories of Cobleskill as you've experienced it, or things that Claude has said as to how he's experienced it. Any thoughts that come to mind?
I think Claude, of course, was born here in Cobleskill.
Yeah.
I'm not a native of Cobleskill, but Claude was born and raised here, and he obviously he likes it here. He's still here,
Right.
and he's had some funny experiences that have happened to him, and he's made a lot of good friends over the years while he's lived here. I know that he did a lot with sports, and so and he made a lot of good friends through sports programming through the high school years. But he's enjoyed it here, and he likes it. He went to college here. He went to the college, and he's now working there. He works. I started to say lives at the college, which is basically what he does. But so he works there, and he likes living in this area. I think if anybody wants to know anything about Cobleskill, he's got a whole knowledge of information wrapped up in that head of his.
If we can only,
Yeah, we can
break
just
that
pry
open,
some
get
of it out.
that. Now, you two were married in the 1950s sometime, was it?
We were married in 1957, and we were married in Newburgh, New York, which is my hometown.
Oh, yes.
And I met Claude here at the college. We were both college students. We waited a couple of years and then decided, yeah, this was right for us. And then he went into service. And so while he was in service, I stayed in Newburgh, and I had a job there and worked. And once he got out of service, though, we decided that we didn't really want to stay in the city and bring up our children in the city. And I liked Cobleskill as well. So we moved back to Cobleskill as soon as he got out of service. In fact, I moved about 6 months before he got out of service. I moved here, and I lived with my mother and father-in-law until he got out of service. And once he was out of service, we found a small house in Barnerville and rented that house for a period of time, about 5 or 6 years, I guess. Then moved to Lawyersville, and then went back to Barnerville. We purchased a house in Barnerville, and we have 3 sons and 1 grandson. And so
That's the famous Aaron, is it?
that's the famous Aaron, right? And then Russell Ray. And that makes me happy because Russell's my maiden name.
Yeah.
So he was named Aaron Russell. And so we're kind of keeping it in the family. So there's a lot of heritage there for Aaron Russell Ray.
Well, that's a darn important point. You made it before, and a good one to make again, is that the children, they'll sometime want to know
That's right.
about their backgrounds.
That's right.
So this whole Cobleskill Remembered will help the children and the whole community, I guess.
Good. Good.
I don't know if there's anything else we have. What do you think?
No, I just wanted to thank you again for allowing me to come and share. I'm very happy to share this because I think it's information that needs to be shared, whether it's just with just Jack Daniels or whether it's with the community. But it's a good thing that you're doing. Just keep up the good work.
Well, I certainly appreciate the opportunity to have Dennis record it, and the committee's work here is great. Good project.
Good. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I'll either make a copy of
I-
it.
Yep. That's what we need. What Greg used to say.
Sure is.
See, was there anything else we had right now?
I don't think there's anything else that we,
Okay.
yet, you want the originals for all the
Yeah,
rest,
and
right?
probably, and there's no real hurry on it. I think what we're probably going to do is concentrate on getting the
Dr. Holmes, what are some of your first memories of a Cobleskill?
I think probably the first real memory of Cobleskill was probably the end of World War I, which I was up home with my mother on the old stone house. Mother was sweeping the porch when the telephone rang and bells started ringing, and the train whistles we could hear as far as Lawyersville. And my father came from getting horses ready for the daily work and asked what all the bell ringing was. And Mother had just received a call from my grandmother, wife of Dr. Franklin P. Baird, and she had told that they'd received the wire in Cobleskill concerning the end of World War I. And she'd also had a telephone call from my uncle David Baird, who was a captain stationed in Fort Lee, Virginia. My uncle, Dr. John Baird, did not get through to them. He was a head of internal medicine and nurses training in Fort Riley, Kansas in World War I. My dad, Floyd Holmes, they had purchased the farm in Lawyersville, and that is my first recollection of Cobleskill. And I guess probably the next big thing in my life was the purchase of the 1923 LaFrance fire engine. Of course, we had to come to town to see that and always took in the movies. But I remember them backing it in the old fire station, which Berard purchased, and which is now, I guess, a beauty saloon. But the old engine, I can remember that when the big hotel burned at Sharon, passing up the front of our farm, and what a engine it was and how it could pump water. In fact, it was used when the Olson fire was on. I understand they even hooked it up out of the pond over here to pump water. I don't know if they did or not, I doubt it. But that is my two earliest recollections of Cobleskill. Of course, my grandfather practiced on Main Street above the Rich store, present Rich store, and he was a breeder of purebred Percheons, being the first individual to import foreign horses into this area. And when he died, my father purchased those horses and we took them to the farm and raised purebred Percheons. Of course, they always were referring to history of the farm here in Cobleskill. The farm was owned by my grandfather, comprised part of the present college, part of KSI, part of the land where the Cobleskill Central School System is, and the land where the present Hammerstone Village is, was all part of the farm. Interesting to me that people thought we all became rich, but we didn't from that. It was sold very reasonable, and it has been always great history. Now, when they built the college in 1916, the story goes that there were two houses moved across the railroad track up onto one of them on Rose Street and one faced Elm Street in back of the present Archer Lumber Company. The house on Rose Street is number 10, presently occupied by Francis Springstead. And that my uncle lived in from the time he was married and before